Hello everyone, in this review I'm going to talk about Sapphirons' latest Fullspeeder Quantum Supernova and look at what the track does well and what it could have done better in my opinion. Even though it's not perfect, this track is among my all-time favorites and it's a safe recommendation for everyone who likes interesting full speeders. Quantum released in September last year and currently has 36 awards as of writing the script. It's using the former ESL Titlepack, which is now called Competition Titlepack, and the second type of full speed in the style that Sapphirons made. First one is called Aerogenetic Overdrive and has a similarly ridiculous name. It also shares a lot of ideas and concepts that now have been refined and built upon here. For now though, and following the track's footsteps, I'll not waste any more time and jump straight into it. The first thing you'll notice when playing the track is the intro, which is quite unique and very interesting, I think. It reminds me of something that old arcade games and older games in general used to have, which is called attract mode. Basically, in old arcade systems, these idle screens showed a gameplay demonstration or short cinematic to attract player to the system and give them an idea of how the game plays before they would be spending their money on it. This can also be found in older games that continued this tradition in order to avoid burning things into your monitor. Nowadays this obviously isn't a problem anymore, so there's really no need to have them, which is why you rarely see them in modern games. But I think it's still a nice touch and it fits their arcade-esque style of Trackmania quite well. You get a nice look at some sections of the track here, and overall it's a very calm and non-obtrusive presentation, which is especially apparent since you get the prompt to start the race almost immediately. Basically, you're not really expected to sit through it all, and you're free to start the race at your own leisure, which is always nice, I think. Starting the race proper now, we are greeted with a start that isn't wasting any unnecessary time and puts the player right into action. It's quite common to have a slower build-up in terms of speed and how much you can relax before you need to steer, but cutting it out here is pretty clever. This track is all about fast-paced action, so instead of trying to be more, it embraces this one aspect, and in doing so stays very focused. I always appreciate it when a game stays true to its main goals and doesn't add any unnecessary features or mechanics, like crafting in an action game or combat in a game that's about sitting back and relaxing. Dissimilar from these games, Quantum understands its own goals perfectly and focuses on nothing but its main selling point. And this being high speed, gravity-defying obstacles, and a spectacular scenery. The first turn follows really quickly then and reinforces the idea of immediate action. It's a turn where you have to steer as much as possible and hold your button down for the entire duration. I'm not quite sure why so many full speeders employ a hard turn like this at the beginning, but I can't really complain about it since it does feel very satisfying. One theory I have is that the possible variance in trajectory is very small at the start, unlike later in the track, where you can have a wide array of possible angles, so it really only works at the start. I actually have quite a lot to say about turns in full speeders in general, especially when it comes to modern full speed. But before straying off too far from the start, there's one more thing I'd like to address. I think we can all agree that Quantum is a pretty nice looking track. There's a lot of attention to detail and the scale of the towers and everything is very impressive. Because of that, it's quite a shame that the track never really uses much of itself as backdrop scenery and never really gives the player a good view of other parts while they're driving. Of course you can always use the free camera, but ideally you want to show as much as possible from a driving point of view. The track instead uses a much more claustrophobic type of scenery, which has other benefits such as guiding the player, but I think it would have been nice to experience this scale and height with some more open areas. The track does open up at some point towards the middle, where there is this area that is being later reused, and it shows a fairly large view into the surrounding areas. This part is really cool, and I think it would have been nice to have some more vistas like this early on in the track. Giving the player a good overview at the start, for example, and showing them something that they will later drive on is a good way to draw people in and make your track more attractive. The first impression is always important after all, and it's the part you're going to spend the most time on anyway when hunting, so it's the most efficient place to put something you spend a lot of time and effort into. which is something an overview or something similar would have done. Speaking about the first impressions, one thing the track does really well, I think, is the way it handles its learning curve. Playing a map for the first time is always a learning experience. This can be a problem in the building process, because it's very easy to develop muscle memory and knowledge that other players cannot possibly have. As such, the learning phase can be quite frustrating if the author doesn't pay attention to things like reaction time and blind spots, where you have to know what's coming or else you don't have a chance to make it. For this reason, you should always aim to make a track fair and give the player enough space and time to react to things. Clear route is another important thing. Using borders to visualize the constraints of the route and highlighting the edges is something that makes driving a lot less ambiguous, and therefore more enjoyable in my opinion. It's just more accessible and doesn't rely on trial and error. Quantum Supernova offers a nice amount of reaction time overall, and has some parts where you can adjust your line pretty well, or even take turns slightly different. The edges of the route are highlighted quite well and look pretty nice overall. However, there are some parts that are kinda hard to follow and understand, if you're not familiar with the track. You see, there's a lot of going on with different light sources, moving signs, shining outlines, and just a general high attention to detail. While this does look very nice, it makes navigation quite difficult, since these things are used way too frequently in order to really be helpful. The human eye naturally sees lights and moving objects before others, and I do believe this is especially true when these objects are in peripheral vision. Obviously, this can be very effective to set up important landmarks and spots that you want to draw attention to, if used lightly, but here there are just too many of them and it works the other way around and highlights nothing instead because everything is equally accentuated. The track is set in nighttime of course, so it is necessary to have a well-lit route, and the track does this really well, which is oftentimes underappreciated. But I do think some signs and lights could have been placed a bit more subtly to not steal the attention that is needed elsewhere. To offset some frustration this might cause, however, are added respawn routes that allow the player to get back into the race from any given checkpoint, via a branching path that leads back onto the track with the right amount of speed. These respawn routes are a very clever addition, I think, and make a lot of sense in the context of this map. Quantum's not exactly easy to finish, at least I don't think so anyway. Among distracting light sources, moving signs, details, and how long the track is, very good reason these things exist, and I think it was certainly worth the effort to put them in. Most of these are really nice and intuitive to drive, and they really transform the way you can approach the track. You can play every part individually, and only once you're familiar you can tackle it as a whole, which is a perfect fit for a track like this. While on the subject of what's fitting and what's not, it's always nice to have a goal in mind when working on a track. This can either be competitive hunting, crafting an experience, a puzzle, or really anything else you have a vision for. Excluding heavily conceptual maps, driving should always be the main focus, at least one of them, and making it fun in some way or form should always be a goal. The thing is, fun is very subjective and not every track is for everyone. This is when additional goals come into play though, and if you say, for example, want to make a competitive tech track, then it should be your number one goal to get this aspect right. This means eliminating all the bugs, making it interesting and enjoyable to hunt, and increasing the skill ceiling as much as possible should be your priority number one. Similarly, when working on an RPG you probably want a more interesting route, so it's an acceptable trade-off to have it less smooth and hunting friendly, get some cool designs instead. Of course, not every track needs to follow any given rules. For example, I personally like my RPGs more fit for hunting, so I make a lot of gameplay considerations that might make it less interesting as a whole, but more streamlined and more fun to drive. In the end, it's all about your personal goal and preferences, and how you're gonna execute them. The more ambitious a goal becomes, then the harder it becomes to reach, especially if you wanna do it really well. might have heard the phrase jack of all trades, master of none, and making something that's good at everything is very difficult, if not impossible. You can often get away with less refined parts if the experience is greater than the sum of its parts, but if you want to perfect one aspect, then it's definitely a better decision to do something more focused, and I think Quantum is exactly that. Quantum Supernova is a track that is very tightly focused in its design, since it's a pure full speeder that's focused on fun gameplay, gravity obstacles and futuristic scenery. These three elements form the core pillars of the track, and everything the track does plays into these in some shape or form. The magnetic areas, for example, are used all throughout the track and explore progressively cascading ideas. The scenery conveys a sense of speed and stays true to its design, and the fun is being had by a fair yet demanding route that isn't overly punishing. Modern full speeders oftentimes use something I like to call invisible borders and feel very restricted as a result. It's like you're driving on invisible rails and one small mistake means you're out since you can't recover your line anymore or slow down because of speed checks. In Quantum this is a lot more forgiving since you actually get the chance to make some mistakes and you can almost always adjust your line. With the added buffer of a bit of reaction time, this makes for a much more interactive experience that is not based on a restricted line, and instead much more free and enjoyable. One of the most striking elements in the scenery here are definitely the arches, which are made by using two quarter pipes that are put together and flipped upside down. Arches in level design are a really great tool when it comes to guiding the player, since they create a natural funnel that is easy to understand and easy to follow. Historically, arches have been used ever since the Roman era, where they have allowed architects to build higher and taller structures. The reason why is because stone and similar material can support a lot of weight, but only when it's translated somewhere into the floor, which is exactly what an arch does. Now, Quantum doesn't use anything like stone, and being a video game doesn't need any arches or supporting elements to obey the laws of physics, but the aesthetics are really cool and create a strong juxtaposition with the more futuristic style the track otherwise has. Blue neon lights and round arches on a cityscape are a really nice combination, I think, and it gives the scenery and the track a very unique personality. Though I'm a pretty big nerd when it comes to arches and other architectural elements from the Gothic and medieval era, so I might be a bit biased. Anyway, speaking about tall structures, another element that is quite prominent here is the tower. Similar to arches, the concept of towers in architecture has been around for a very long time. In fact, towers have been around for much longer, dating back all the way to 8000 BC and the Sumerian era. The towers in Quantum have some really interesting shapes and details, which makes them really pleasant to look at, be it up close or from a distance. The curvature towards the bottom reinforces elegance, and the pipes almost makes them feel industrial, which fits really well with the overall aesthetic. In video games and other media, towers are often used to get some more verticality and height into a level, and I'm personally always a big fan of anything that uses the 3D space to its full potential. Using the Z-axis in a 3-dimensional space is something not many tracks do. Most of them are rather flat, but Sapphirons use all the space available here, at least without hacking the game using a tool like OpenPlanet. As a result, the height changes add a lot of variance and make the route very dynamic. Seeing the towers in the distance while driving is another cool touch and supports the idea of scale. A lot of the track is actually being supported by poles, towers and other structures, which lend the track a lot more credibility. Of course, as I said, you don't need to worry about obeying the laws of physics, but I think it's always a nice touch if you give it some consideration. Unfortunately, this is where one of the biggest missed opportunities comes in my opinion, because the track isn't showing any of these supporting structures in the gravity areas. These parts would really benefit the most from having them visible, because having visual context would really sell the idea of driving upside down. As it is now, there really isn't enough of a visual indication whether you're driving on the ceiling or just on the floor as usual. These tower bases here, for example, look like they're regular spires and should have been extended all the way down to reinforce the idea of gravity and making it more clear where you're currently at. The walled-off ceiling is similarly damaging in that regard, since seeing the water and lower parts of the track above you would have contextualized the rotation and would have made for a very cool moment, I think. Additionally, leaving some parts open would also make for a better contrast between open and closed areas, which is something the track has a lot of. On a positive note though, the scenery is very consistent in its overall presentation and features many cool shapes and details. There's a lot of time and effort spent on it, which you can definitely see. The lights you can see practically everywhere, for example, are all hand-placed, and if you ever worked with them, then you probably know how finicky and annoying it can be to get them into the right place. Especially when working on curvatures or placing them underneath another block, it can get very frustrating. The camera and the editor can't actually look upwards, so you kind of have to place them above a block and then carefully move them down a set amount, get them to the right place, but it's blind and it's terrible. The scenery also features a lot of geometric shapes like circles and rectangles that are really well put together and has some pretty unique and interesting forms. I especially like the part here that uses more rectangular pieces and then transitions into more round objects as we approach the reuse. As a concept, I really like this reuse, but I think it does feel a bit forced. The part in between just isn't as interesting and feels a bit constrained due to the fact that it needed to end up at the same height and position. This entrance after the gravity section is also the tightest part of the track and doesn't feel particularly flowy in my opinion. The borders of Quantum Supernova are quite nice and functional, with most of them clearly showing the edges of the route and not giving false information about too wide or too narrow turns. I do have a few nitpicks here and there, however. First of all, there's a gap here and a similar one here, where you can completely fly out. In and of itself, this obviously isn't a problem, but next to it there's this border that isn't congruent with the edges of the route. And when you drive these parts, you want to be as close as possible to this edge in order to get the shortest and fastest line possible. So precision matters a lot. Thanks to this border, this isn't really clear, and looking at it suggests that you have all of the space available, which is obviously not true. As a whole, these two wall rides are very bad at showing the player the line. There is an invisible border, but nothing that you can actually see and digest in the moment. There are a lot of rectangles and other shapes, but none of it is congruent with the actual edges, and as such it's quite ambiguous and not very clear. It also doesn't help that these wallride blocks all have a shining outline and are curved by nature, which restricts vision and makes it even harder to see what's going on. I remember having some trouble on this part, and I imagine it's a difficulty spike for other people as well. The part you see me flying out here doesn't have any borders at all, and as I said, you can't really see what's coming. This turn here is a bit tight. I think a few additional blocks in length and maybe half a block towards the right would have made it more open and forgiving. The border can also be quite annoying, because it's not properly connected to the platform, so it's not 100% clear how far you can actually go. Again, it matters because precision is important, and given how tight the turn is, it's natural that you will get very close to this edge. And since it's not connected, you can't really see how far exactly you can go. One thing about the scenery that can easily be taken for granted is the color palette. Quantum Supernova uses a contrast between orange and blue, which is a combination that works really well together, I think. It's one of the most commonly used contrasts in art and uses a warm and cold color to convey a sense of balance. The track is pretty consistent to not break this palette, but there are some yellow elements like the boosters, the upper parts of the checkpoints, and some moving signs, but overall it's very consistent. The night mode in Trackmania kind of forces you to use blue, because wall ride and roadblocks have a natural blue outline on them by default that cannot be turned off, so it's really just about choosing a complementary color to blue, which orange fits perfectly in my opinion. The text in the intro and the track name also use the same color palette, which is a nice touch. Overall I really like the colors and the shapes and forms that are used in the scenery. I also like the speed and the gravity-defying obstacles that made me question my sense of direction and the overall presentation, the intro, and how interactive and fun it is to just play the map. Quantum Supernova has a lot to love, and my negative points are not here because it's a bad track, but because it's a great map with some flaws. Making a map like this takes a lot of time and effort, and it's easy to take things for granted, especially if you're writing a smug video essay. I hope I convinced at least some of you to try the map, and I hope you enjoyed what I had to say about it. With all of that being said, thank you very much for watching, and eat weed.